On the morning of the 1st of May, 1851, something opened its eyes in Hyde Park, London, that no human being had ever seen before. Not a cathedral, not a palace of stone. Something else entirely. A structure so transparent, so enormous, so geometrically precise that the people who walked up to it from Kensington Road stopped dead. Some of them, according to letters and diary entries preserved in the archives of the Victoria and Albert Museum, genuinely could not tell whether they were looking at a building or at a trick of the light. One visitor wrote that she had to press her palm against the glass just to confirm it was solid. Another wrote that the building seemed to have no walls at all, only air organized into the shape of a house the length of nearly 6 city blocks. A house with trees growing inside it. A house assembled in less time than it takes most builders to lay a foundation. And here is the question that this investigation keeps coming back to, the one that does not go quietly away. How, precisely, does a structure like that get built in the middle of the 19th century, with no electrical machinery, no computer-aided fabrication, no prefabricated supply chains in the modern sense, and no architect of record, only a man who had spent his career growing orchids? And then, after standing for 85 years and surviving 2 wars, 2 fires, and a financial collapse, why does it burn down on a single November night in 1936, with the cause officially listed as undetermined and no formal public inquiry ever opened? Welcome to Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and if you have found this channel for the first time, this is the place where we do not rush past the uncomfortable details of history. We sit with them. We turn them over. We ask the questions that the official record seems perfectly comfortable leaving unanswered. If that sounds like your kind of conversation, hit subscribe right now, because every single episode goes somewhere the textbooks tend to avoid. And leave a comment below this video. Tell me where you think this story goes. I want to hear your instincts before I give you mine, because sometimes the audience sees things the narrator misses. Tonight we are going deep into what I call the Crystal Palace problem. 6 chapters. A building that should not have existed when it did. An exhibition that was something considerably more than an exhibition. Exhibits that quietly vanished after the closing ceremony. A fire whose cause was never determined. And a very specific pattern of erasure that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. There is something buried in the story of 1851 that the standard history course skims over in a paragraph. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand why that paragraph stays so short. Stay with me. The Gardener and the Glass Cathedral. Let us begin with the official story, because the official story is already strange enough to raise questions before we add anything to it. The year is 1849. Prince Albert, consort of Queen Victoria, and a man the historical record consistently describes as unusually forward-thinking for his position, conceives of an idea. He wants to host the first truly international exhibition of industry and manufacturing. Not a national show. A global one. He wants every country on Earth to send its most impressive products to a single building in London so that the world can see, in one place, what the 19th century had become. He partners with a civil servant named Henry Cole, who had, among other things, been instrumental in standardizing the British postal system, and together they begin organizing what would eventually be called the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations. The problem was immediate and enormous. They needed a building. Not just any building, a temporary structure, because Parliament had made clear the venue could not become permanent in Hyde Park. It needed to cover an area capable of housing exhibits from 44 foreign nations and the entirety of the British Empire. It needed to go up in roughly a year, and it needed to come back down again when the exhibition closed. A design competition was organized in early 1850. Nearly 245 entries arrived from architects across Europe. Every single one of them was rejected. The building committee, which included the engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, produced its own composite design. That was rejected too. The situation was verging on embarrassing when a man named Joseph Paxton asked if he could try. Now, the framing of Paxton as a simple gardener is technically accurate but deeply misleading. Paxton had spent decades as the head gardener for the 6th Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, and during that time became one of the most innovative glass structure engineers in England. He had designed and built the Great Conservatory at Chatsworth, the largest glass building in the world at its completion in 1840. He had developed a patented ridge and furrow roof system allowing rainwater to drain from glass surfaces at scale. He was, in every meaningful sense, the foremost living expert in prefabricated glass and iron architecture. The Gardner framing, while not inaccurate, tends to obscure just how precisely qualified he was for this specific job. Paxton sketched his initial concept during a Midland Railway Board meeting on a piece of blotting paper, while other business was being discussed. He submitted detailed calculations and costings within 2 weeks. The committee accepted his design in July of 1850. That left him, as architectural historian Jan Piggott documented in research published by the Crystal Palace Foundation, less than 8 months to finalize plans, manufacture every component, and erect a complete structure in a royal park. What followed is either one of the most remarkable feats of industrial organization in the 19th century, or it suggests that some components of this story were more developed beforehand than the official timeline implies. Perhaps both things are true simultaneously. That, as we will see, is a recurring feature of this story. The numbers attached to the Crystal Palace are the kind that require a moment to absorb. The finished building measured 1,848 feet in length and 456 feet in width. Its floor area was 990,000 square feet. The ceiling of the central transept reached 135 feet from the ground, high enough to enclose 3 mature elm trees that were already growing on the site. The structure consumed 4,500 tons of cast iron, 5,500 cubic meters of timber, and 293,000 individual panes of glass. According to architectural documentation reviewed in publications by Architecture Today, there were also 300,000 nuts and bolts used in its assembly, and these were among the first standardized fasteners ever produced in Britain, conforming to specifications developed by the engineer Joseph Whitworth that would eventually become the British standard. The guttering alone ran for 48 kilometers. All of this was completed in 190 days by approximately 2,000 laborers who had never built anything like it before. At peak installation, over 18,000 panes of glass were being fitted per week, according to contemporary construction records. Each pane was identical, cut to the same dimensions at the Chance Brothers Glassworks in Smethwick, the only facility in Britain capable of filling such an order at that precision. The demand was so large that Chance Brothers had to import skilled workers from the Saint-Gobain glassworks in France to meet the deadline. The production of those 293,000 identical panels in a period when industrial glass manufacturing was still primarily a handcraft is a detail that engineers and historians of technology have noted deserves more attention than it usually receives. And yet here is something worth sitting with before we move on. All of this, the design, the manufacturing, the delivery logistics, the assembly schedule, the standardized components, the coordinated labor force, was organized without computers, without electrical communication, without motorized transport, and without any prior template. The nearest comparable project, by any measure of scale or complexity, had been the construction of the great railway stations of the 1840s, which had taken years and significant trial and error. The Crystal Palace went from a blotting paper sketch to a completed building in 8 months. That is either a testimony to Victorian organizational genius of the highest order, or it suggests that some of the components of this story were more developed beforehand than the official timeline implies. Either explanation has interesting implications, and we are only just getting started. 6 million witnesses to something that should not have been possible. When the Crystal Palace opened on the 1st of May, 1851, the scene was documented by every major newspaper in the English-speaking world, and the language those newspapers used is revealing. Queen Victoria recorded her impressions in her personal journal, writing that the day was one of the greatest and most glorious of her life, describing crowds streaming through Hyde Park, carriages, troops, and a building that, in her words, made her heart swell with wonder. The monarch visited the exhibition not 3 times with her family, as protocol might have suggested, but 34 additional times on her own. 34. That detail appears in the official records of the royal household. Whatever was inside that building, it held the attention of the queen of the largest empire in the world for an entire summer. And the public arrived with a force that the organizers had not fully anticipated. Over 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition between its opening in May and its closure on the 15th of October, 1851. According to research published by the Gazette Office, that figure represents roughly 1/3 of the entire population of Britain at the time. The average daily attendance across the exhibition's run was 42,831 people. On the 7th of October, attendance peaked at 109,915 in a single day. To put that in context, the largest football stadiums in England today hold around 90,000. The Crystal Palace, in its first and only season in Hyde Park, exceeded that figure more than once, using only foot traffic, horse-drawn omnibuses, and the newly completed railway lines. Thomas Cook arranged transport to the exhibition for 150,000 people, a decisive moment in the development of his business model. People arrived from France, the German states, the United States, India, Australia. An official report suggested 3 times as many people entered Britain during the exhibition period as the previous year. The exhibition was, by any reasonable measure, the first global media event. Its audience physically traveled to attend, and millions did. But what were they actually seeing when they walked through those glass walls? The exhibits covered 16 kilometers of display tables arranged across 8 miles of gallery space. The official descriptive catalog, preserved in the British Library, lists more than 13,000 exhibits from 44 countries and every territory of the British Empire. The western half of the building was devoted to Britain and its colonies. The eastern half held contributions from the rest of the world. The categories were raw materials, machinery, manufactures, and fine arts. Within those categories, the range was extraordinary. There was a jacquard loom demonstrating mechanized pattern weaving. There was an envelope folding machine that could produce thousands of envelopes per hour at a time when envelopes were still individually handmade by most stationers. There was a hydraulic press of a scale that visitors described as incomprehensible. Samuel Colt, the American firearms manufacturer, demonstrated his prototype for what would become the 1851 Colt Navy revolver, alongside his older Walker and Dragoon models. According to the official exhibition catalog, a device called the Tempest Prognosticator was displayed, a barometer that used live leeches to predict changes in atmospheric pressure. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, then the largest known diamond in the world, was shown in the India exhibit, though contemporary accounts noted that visitors found it somewhat disappointing under its initial lighting, and that it had to be redisplayed with artificial illumination later in the run. The fountain at the center of the building stood 27 feet high and was constructed from 4 tons of pink crystal glass. There was a pipe organ. There was an 8-meter glass fountain. There were full-sized locomotives. There were complete house interiors. And all of this sat inside a building whose walls and ceiling were transparent, which meant that on clear days the interior was simultaneously illuminated by natural light from every direction and by the internal reflections of hundreds of thousands of glass panels. Visitors who wrote letters home about the experience, letters now held in various county archives and family collections across England, consistently reached for language that had nothing to do with exhibition halls. They wrote about light. They wrote about sky. They wrote that the inside felt like the outside, except more so. One visitor's letter, cited in a study by the Victorian Society, described the interior as a kind of hallucination, a space that refused to behave like a space. That experience of disorientation was not accidental, and this is where the story begins to shift from simple spectacle towards something with more calculated edges. The Crystal Palace was not just a container for exhibits. It was, by design, an environment that altered the psychological state of everyone who entered it. The transparency, the scale, the light, the living trees enclosed within a built structure, all of it combined to produce a condition of sustained mild bewilderment in millions of visitors. You cannot think critically about a product when you cannot quite locate the ceiling. You cannot evaluate an exhibit with your usual skepticism when the building around you has suspended your ordinary sense of where you are. And the products being displayed were, in the main, products of British imperial industry. The message being delivered inside that bewildering space was a very specific one. British civilization had arrived at something beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension, and the building was the proof. What do you think is really going on here? Is this the natural pride of an industrial nation showing off its achievements, or does the deliberate architecture of disorientation suggest something more calculated? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The laboratory of the crowd. Before the Great Exhibition opened, the doubters were loud. The Times had opposed the use of Hyde Park entirely. The MP Charles Sibthorpe, whose opposition is documented in parliamentary records, called it one of the greatest humbugs and frauds ever known. There were genuine anxieties in government circles about what happens when you bring 6 million people, many from the urban working class, many from foreign nations with different political traditions, into a concentrated space over 6 months. These were not unreasonable anxieties by the standards of 1851. The revolutions of 1848 had swept across Europe just 3 years earlier. The Chartist movement in Britain had only recently quieted after years of pressing for radical democratic reform. Hosting a mass public event in the heart of London was a genuine calculated risk. And how that risk was managed tells us something important about what the Great Exhibition was actually designed to accomplish, beyond the simple celebration of industrial progress. The ticket pricing structure is instructive. In the first 3 weeks, entry was priced at 5 shillings, restricting attendance to the wealthier classes. On Fridays and Saturdays throughout the run, the price remained elevated. But Monday through Thursday, after the initial premium period, entry dropped to 1 shilling, the equivalent of roughly 5 modern pence. At 1 shilling, the exhibition was accessible to factory workers, agricultural laborers, the urban poor. Those 1 shilling visitors arrived by the millions, carried to London by cheap excursion trains organized by operators like Thomas Cook. They came from Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, and the countryside, and they filed in their hundreds of thousands through a building designed and run by the Royal Commission, under a set of rules and social expectations that the Commission had very carefully thought through in advance. The social historians who have studied the Great Exhibition most carefully have noted that the exhibition functioned as the largest experiment in managed public assembly that had ever been attempted. The layout of the building directed visitor movement in specific patterns. The placement of the British exhibits in the prominent western section and the colonial exhibits in subordinate positions was not accidental. The refreshment arrangements were designed to keep visitors comfortable and therefore tractable. Messrs. Schweppes had paid £5,000 for the exclusive right to run the 4 refreshment rooms, a commercial arrangement that prefigures the corporate sponsorship of modern public events by more than a century and a half. The policing arrangements were equally deliberate. The exhibition was patrolled by a dedicated force whose function was crowd management as much as security. Reports suggest the atmosphere inside the Crystal Palace was, by the standards of any other mass gathering of the period, remarkably orderly. There were no riots, no political demonstrations, no significant theft or vandalism, despite exhibits worth enormous sums. The Koh-i-Noor diamond sat in the Indian exhibit for 6 months and was seen by millions. Managing that fact alone required security planning that was, in 1851, largely unprecedented. What the Great Exhibition demonstrated was that a very large population of people with genuinely divergent political and economic interests could be gathered together and kept not just peaceful, but actively enthusiastic if the space was sufficiently spectacular and the programming sufficiently engaging. The working-class visitor from Sheffield was not thinking about Chartist reform while he stood beneath a barrel-vaulted glass ceiling watching a hydraulic press demonstrate forces beyond anything in his own workshop. He was thinking about the press. The spectacle had displaced the grievance, not permanently, not forever, but for the duration of the visit. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more interesting than a conspiracy. It is a discovery. The organizers of the Great Exhibition learned, empirically and at enormous scale, that spectacle administered in the right environment can temporarily reorganize the priorities of a mass audience. That knowledge did not stay in Hyde Park. It traveled. The Paris Exposition of 1855, the Vienna World Exhibition of 1873, the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, all drew direct lessons from the organizational model of 1851. The Crystal Palace was the proof of concept, and if you are wondering what concept precisely, the answer is this. A government can manage the political energy of a discontented population by giving it something large enough and bright enough and strange enough to look at. If you are finding this investigation worth following, now is the moment to subscribe to Epoch Reset. Not because of an algorithm, but because what we are building here, case file by case file, century by century, is a continuous investigation into how power has always arranged the furniture of public attention. This is the kind of channel you find and then go back to from the beginning. Subscribe and start from the top. The exhibits that should not have been there. Let us talk about what was actually inside the Crystal Palace in a more specific sense, because the catalog of exhibits raises questions that the standard history of the event tends to sidestep. The official descriptive catalog runs to multiple volumes and is preserved in the British Library. It lists more than 13,000 objects. Most of them are exactly what you would expect from an 1851 industrial exhibition. Textiles, ceramics, furniture, raw materials, agricultural tools, steam engines. But scattered through that catalog are items that require a more careful second look, items that raise questions not about supernatural forces or hidden civilizations, but about the actual pace and distribution of technological development in the mid-19th century, and about what happened to certain technologies after the exhibition closed. Consider the communication technologies on display. The electric telegraph, which had only been commercially introduced in Britain in 1839, was exhibited in its most advanced form available at the time. But alongside it were exhibited devices that most visitors in 1851 would have had no conceptual framework to understand. Multiple exhibitors displayed electrical instruments of a complexity that the engineering historians who have subsequently analyzed the catalog, including those whose work appears in the Proceedings of the Institution of Electrical Engineers, have noted were significantly beyond what was then in commercial production. The gap between what was displayed as a demonstration technology in the Crystal Palace and what became commercially available to the general public over the following decade is, in several cases, considerably wider than one would expect if the exhibition was simply showing contemporary state-of-the-art. The photography exhibits are another area where the record invites scrutiny. The Great Exhibition was one of the first occasions on which photography was publicly exhibited at scale. According to documentation held in the Royal Collection Archives, approximately 700 photographs were shown, including daguerreotypes, calotypes, and stereoscopic cards from England, France, Austria, and the United States. But the technical quality of some of the photographic work on display was, according to subsequent analysis by photography historians, surprisingly advanced for the publicly acknowledged state of the art in 1851. The daguerreotype process had been publicly revealed only in 1839. Within 12 years, the Crystal Palace was showing photographic work of a refinement that implies a degree of development not fully accounted for in the standard timeline of the technology. Then there is the question of what happened to the exhibits after the closing ceremony on the 15th of October, 1851. Prince Albert closed the exhibition that day with a formal ceremony, and then the business of dispersal began. Some exhibits were purchased by the exhibition commissioners and went on to form the foundation of what became the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Science Museum in South Kensington. Some were returned to their exhibitors. Some were sold at auction. The proceeds of the exhibition, which came to a surplus of £186,000 according to the official financial records, were invested in the construction of what came to be known as Albertopolis, the cultural quarter in South Kensington that now houses the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, Imperial College, the Royal College of Music, and the Royal Albert Hall. But a significant portion of the exhibit objects simply disappear from the record. The official descriptive catalog accounts for what was shown. It does not systematically account for where everything went afterward. Research published in Londonist magazine, examining the question of surviving Great Exhibition objects in detail, has found that the fate of a substantial number of exhibits, particularly those representing advanced mechanical and electrical technologies, is genuinely unclear. Some entered private collections whose contents have never been made fully public. Some were acquired by institutions whose acquisition records from that period are incomplete. Some were simply never mentioned again in any publication or official record after October 1851. This is not necessarily sinister. The dispersal of a 13,000-object exhibition in the 19th century, without digital inventory systems or standardized provenance tracking, was inevitably going to leave gaps in the documentary record. But the specific pattern of those gaps is worth noting. The items most thoroughly documented afterward tend to be the decorative arts, the ceramics, the furniture, the textiles, the objects of obvious aesthetic value. The items whose post-exhibition fate is most opaque tend to be the mechanical, the electrical, and the scientific instruments. The trophy telescope has a documented history after the exhibition, but many of the electrical instruments, the advanced measuring devices, the experimental machinery, have histories that go quiet in October 1851 and do not clearly resume. There is a name that connects the Crystal Palace to a technology whose significance in 1851 is often underappreciated. John Logie Baird, the Scottish inventor who developed working television in the 1920s, had his research laboratories in the Crystal Palace at Sydenham in the years immediately before the fire of 1936. When the building burned, Baird's television studio, his tube manufacturing equipment, and an uncertain quantity of his research records burned with it. The loss of Baird's laboratory in the fire is documented in contemporary newspaper reports. The full extent of what was lost in those laboratories has never been precisely established. This is, on its own, simply a fact about a fire. But it becomes more interesting when placed alongside the broader pattern of technological material associated with the Crystal Palace, having an unusual tendency to disappear from the accessible record. We cannot confirm a connection. We can note that the pattern exists. What do you think is happening with the technological exhibits? Is this simply the expected documentary chaos of the 19th century? Or does the specific pattern of what survived and what disappeared suggest something worth investigating more carefully? I want your read on this in the comments. Your perspective shapes where this investigation goes next. The architecture of forgetting. In the autumn of 1851, with the exhibition closed and the question of the Crystal Palace's future unresolved, a debate began that illuminates something important about how the Victorian establishment related to its own most spectacular creation. Parliament had been clear from the beginning that the building could not remain permanently in Hyde Park. The terms of the exhibition's use of the park were explicit on this point. The structure was temporary. It would need to come down. But the public reaction to the prospect of demolition was intense and largely hostile. Newspapers reported widespread sentiment that the Crystal Palace had become something more than an exhibition building. It had become, in the short space of 5 months, a symbol of something that the public was not ready to relinquish. Paxton, by then knighted by Queen Victoria in recognition of his achievement, proposed a solution. The building could be disassembled, transported, and re-erected at a new location. The modular system that had made rapid construction possible also made relocation theoretically viable. A consortium of 8 businessmen whose names and corporate connections are documented in the records of the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway, among other sources, formed a holding company called the Crystal Palace Company. They raised £1.3 million through a share issue, purchased the building from its original contractors, Fox and Henderson, secured 349 acres of land on Sydenham Hill in South London, and began the process of dismantling and relocating the structure. The rebuilding at Sydenham, completed in 1854, was not a simple relocation. The new Crystal Palace was a substantially larger and more elaborate building. The main gallery was redesigned with a full barrel-vaulted roof. The central transept was greatly enlarged. 2 massive water towers, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, were added at either end. The total length of the rebuilt structure reached 1,608 feet. Queen Victoria reopened it on the 10th of June, 1854, in a ceremony that rivaled the original opening 3 years earlier. The new Crystal Palace at Sydenham was a different kind of institution. Where the Hyde Park exhibition had been a 6-month event with a clear beginning and end, the Sydenham Palace was conceived as a permanent cultural center offering exhibitions, concerts, and entertainment on an ongoing basis. The grounds were developed with elaborate Italian gardens, fountains with jets reaching 250 feet, a maze, and life-size dinosaur models commissioned from the sculptor Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins. Educational establishments operated from the site. The FA Cup final was held on the grounds between 1895 and 1914, with attendances sometimes exceeding 100,000. But the Sydenham Crystal Palace was haunted by financial instability from almost the beginning. The cost of developing the grounds had been enormous. The maintenance of a glass and iron structure of that scale required constant investment. Admission revenues, while substantial, never quite kept pace with operating costs. By the 1890s, according to reports in the Illustrated London News of that period, the building was showing signs of neglect. Areas were being closed off. Repairs were being deferred. The cultural programming that had made the palace a destination was becoming thinner. In 1911, the Crystal Palace Company was formally declared bankrupt. The building and grounds were acquired through a fundraising campaign by the nation, becoming the property of a charitable trust under the control of the Ministry of Education. The First World War transformed the palace again. The building was requisitioned by the Royal Navy, which used it as a training facility and shore station under the designation HMS Victory. Over 125,000 men and women serving in the Royal Naval Air Service, the Royal Naval Division, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, and the Women's Royal Naval Service were trained there, according to figures documented by the Crystal Palace Foundation. The building, which had been built with precision tolerances and maintained under glass by skilled workers for 60 years, was occupied by naval training operations for 4 years without any particular attention to conservation. When the Navy left, the condition of the building had deteriorated significantly from what it had been before the war. A new manager, Henry Buckland, was appointed and, according to accounts collected by the Crystal Palace Foundation, performed something close to a miracle of restoration. Under his management, the building was cleaned, repaired, and gradually returned to something approaching its former condition. Small profits began to appear in the accounts. The 1930s brought additional activity. John Logie Baird opened his television studios and tube manufacturing plant in sections of the building. An orchestra rehearsed regularly in the Garden Hall. The palace seemed to be entering a new phase of relevance. And then, on the evening of the 30th of November, 1936, something caught fire in the women's cloakroom in the central transept. Within 5 minutes of discovery, the fire had moved beyond any ability to control. The Penge Fire Brigade received its first call at 7:59 in the evening. By 8:30, it was clear the situation was catastrophic. Eventually, 88 fire engines arrived from 4 separate brigades, alongside 438 firefighters and 749 police officers. 100,000 people gathered on Sydenham Hill to watch. The glow in the sky was visible 80 miles away. Pilots of commercial aircraft crossing the English Channel reported seeing it. Winston Churchill was among the crowd on the hill. He reportedly looked at the flames and said it was the end of an age. By the morning of the 1st of December, nothing remained of the building. The iron frame, the glass, the wooden floors, Baird's television laboratories, the 90,000-pound pipe organ, the educational collections, the archives, all of it was gone. The water towers survived and were demolished in 1941 because military authorities determined they would provide easily identifiable landmarks for German bombers approaching London. The dinosaurs in the park survived, as did the terraces and some external stonework, and they remain in Crystal Palace Park today as the only physical remnants of the original site. The cause of the fire was never officially determined. The investigation that would normally follow a fire of that magnitude was not opened because of a jurisdictional technicality. As documented in research published by the Fiddlebase Historical Archive, the Crystal Palace stood on the park side of Crystal Palace Parade, which in 1936 fell under Kent County jurisdiction. Under Kent law at the time, a formal public inquiry into a fire required evidence of at least one death. There were no confirmed deaths. Therefore, no inquiry was legally required, and no inquiry was held. The cause of the most destructive peacetime fire in 20th century London remained officially undetermined. Some contemporaries believed it was arson. Some believed it was accident. Researchers who have subsequently examined the available evidence, including Robert Knowles, whose detailed investigation was published by the Crystal Palace Foundation under the title Crystal Palace, Accident or Arson, have found the arson theory to be thoroughly argued and well supported by circumstantial evidence, while acknowledging that no definitive conclusion is possible given the absence of a formal investigation. The record is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that a decision was made not to investigate. Whether that decision was the result of bureaucratic accident or something more deliberate is a question the available documents cannot resolve. What the light left behind. Let us come back to the beginning, not to the fire of 1936, but to the spring of 1851, when 6 million people filed through a building made of light and came out with their view of civilization permanently altered. Because that is what the Crystal Palace actually accomplished at the deepest level, and it is why understanding it matters beyond architectural history or the cataloging of Victorian exhibits. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was the first event in human history to successfully deliver to a mass audience of millions a coherent and emotionally persuasive narrative about the future. Not a written narrative, not a spoken one. A spatial narrative, a walk-through argument. The visitor who entered the Crystal Palace entered a simulation. Everything inside it was curated to tell a single story. that industrial civilization, and specifically British industrial civilization, had achieved something unprecedented, and that its achievements would continue to accelerate until the world had been thoroughly transformed for the better. The building itself was the first exhibit, a structure that could not, by the conventional understanding of the time, exist, and yet demonstrably did. If the building was real, the story it contained was also real. This is not a fringe interpretation. The academic literature on the Great Exhibition, including the work of Paul Young, whose study Globalization and the Great Exhibition was published by Palgrave Macmillan, and Jeffrey Auerbach, whose book The Great Exhibition of 1851, A Nation on Display, appeared through Yale University Press, consistently identifies the exhibition as a watershed moment in the history of managed public narrative. Auerbach in particular argues that the exhibition was less about displaying British industrial achievement than about constructing a version of that achievement that was simultaneously true enough to be credible and selective enough to serve specific political purposes. The selection of what was shown and how it was shown, the exclusion of the more troubling aspects of the industrial economy, the labor conditions, the poverty, the inequality, was as deliberate as the inclusion of the hydraulic presses and the Koh-i-Noor. The colonial dimension of the exhibition has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades. The eastern half of the Crystal Palace contained exhibits from every territory of the British Empire, but the arrangement was not neutral. The exhibits from India, the Caribbean, and Africa were predominantly raw materials, textiles, agricultural products, minerals. The message embedded in that arrangement was one visitors absorbed without necessarily articulating. The periphery produced materials, and the center produced finished goods, and this hierarchy was natural. The London Museum's current interpretation of the exhibition explicitly notes that the imperial displays presented economies as exotic and underdeveloped, implying a racial hierarchy that was intended to further justify imperialism. The light that poured through those glass walls illuminated everything, but not everything equally. The surplus generated by the exhibition, £186,000, was invested in Albertopolis. This is a fact that deserves a moment. The profits of a 6-month public spectacle were used to build a permanent cultural quarter that would shape the intellectual life of London for the next century and a half. The Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Royal Albert Hall, Imperial College London. All of them trace their founding collections and their buildings directly back to the Crystal Palace of 1851. The spectacle financed the permanent institutions of record. The temporary building of light paid for the structures that would decide what story got told afterward. And it is worth asking clearly, who decided what those institutions would emphasize, and how does that emphasis connect to the narrative that was delivered inside the Crystal Palace in the summer of 1851? The pattern that emerges when you look at the full arc of the Crystal Palace story is one of deliberate construction and equally deliberate erasure. The building was assembled under conditions of extraordinary urgency. It was used for 6 months to deliver a specific narrative to millions. It was then moved, altered, and kept operational for 85 years. When it became financially unsustainable and architecturally compromised, it burned. The investigation that should have followed did not happen. The physical remains were cleared. The research laboratories of a pioneer of communications technology burned with the building, and their contents were never fully accounted for. And within a fortnight of the fire, a king had abdicated and a continent was moving toward war, which made the questions surrounding the Crystal Palace seem considerably less pressing than they otherwise might have been. None of this proves a coordinated design. The record does not support that conclusion, and we should not claim it does. What it suggests is something more mundane, and in some ways more unsettling. That the mechanisms by which large-scale public narratives are constructed, delivered, and then allowed to fade tend to follow recognizable patterns. The Crystal Palace was not the last time an institution would build a spectacular temporary environment to deliver a specific story to a mass audience and then carefully manage what remained afterward. The World's Fairs of the late 19th century followed the same logic. The mega events of the 20th century followed it too. The Crystal Palace was the proof of concept. What has been built on that concept since is a subject for another investigation. Here is something worth noting before we close this case file. The Crystal Palace never entirely disappeared from the imagination. The area of South London where it stood still carries its name. The football club, the park, the local railway station, all of them still carry that name. The dinosaurs that Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins built for the grounds in 1854 still stand in Crystal Palace Park today, preserved as Grade 1 listed monuments. Stone creatures built to amaze a Victorian public still standing in a South London park, while everything else, the glass, the iron, the exhibits, the laboratories, the fire investigation, the formal record of what happened on the 30th of November 1936 has long since been cleared away or left officially unresolved. There is one more thing. The water towers Brunel designed for Sydenham, the ones that survived the fire, were demolished in 1941 because military authorities determined they would help German bombers navigate to London. Those towers were the last major structural remnant above ground, and their demolition completed the physical erasure of the Crystal Palace from the landscape 90 years after it was first raised in Hyde Park. Grass now grows where the glass ceiling stood, and below that grass, according to surveys conducted by the Crystal Palace Foundation, the iron foundations of the original Sydenham structure still lie undisturbed. The building was erased above ground. Below ground, the record is still there. I want to leave you with one question before you close this video. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was, by every measure, a staggering success. 6 million visitors, a surplus that built lasting cultural institutions, engineering that set the template for the century to come, 6 months without a significant incident of disorder. And yet, within 85 years, the centerpiece of that success had burned, its cause undetermined, its investigation unheld, its research laboratories unaccounted for, its memory managed down to a public park with some Victorian dinosaurs and a football team. What do you think that pattern tells us? Is this simply the ordinary life cycle of a building that outlived its moment? Or does the specific texture of how the Crystal Palace ended, the fire, the no inquiry, the erasure, the timing, suggest that something about this particular story was considered worth not examining too closely? Leave me your thoughts in the comments. This is the conversation this investigation needs you to be part of. Every comment you leave shapes where we look next, and if this is the first Epoch Reset investigation you have encountered, you now know what we do here. We take the cases that history closed without fully opening. We read the documents that are still there if you know where to look. We follow the pattern of what was erased as carefully as the pattern of what was preserved. Subscribe, because the next case file connects to this one in ways that will not be obvious until we get there. The investigation is continuous. The chain of inquiry does not stop. It only deepens. I am Elliot Carter. This is Epoch Reset, and the 19th century still has more to tell us than it has so far been asked.